This is Anything for You. Sweet Haven Farm, Sweet Small Town Romance, Book 4. Written by Jessie Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. Episode 4. Chapter 7. The next morning, McCoy went into the office before leaving for northern Pennsylvania. He bypassed his own office. There was nothing in there for him except paperwork, and he barely ever used it. He walked directly to his supervisor's door, nodding at Loretta the receptionist as he passed. He'd been thinking he should mention the elephant, but he knew once he did, his supervisor, Louie, would be after him to put pressure on Jillian to have a permit. She had 30 days. He could give her that without a struggle. "Todd's in there with Louie," Loretta said. "Thanks for letting me know." Todd was his main competition for the promotion. "Louie said to come straight to his office when I got in." "Then go in," Loretta said, her hand moving back away from the intercom button. McCoy tapped on the door before he opened it, years of courtesy drummed into him from his childhood. "Come in," Louie called as McCoy pushed the door open. The office was sparsely furnished. Louie sat behind the large, messy desk, and Todd sprawled in a chair opposite him. He looked up with a smirk when McCoy came in. As far as McCoy knew, they got along okay, although Todd maybe cut corners that McCoy wouldn't. He was also much better at buttering up the boss. McCoy was much more serious about his job and took all the extra work he could. Todd liked to kick back on the evenings and weekends. "Hey, great to see you." Louie nodded to the other chair. "You ready to head up north and set a trap for that bear that keeps getting into Elk County dumpsters?" "I'm leaving after I get done here." "Great." Louie stroked his beard. "Todd told me that he had a report of an elephant at the wedding just down the road from your house last weekend." McCoy's heart fell. He thought they had gotten off without anyone noticing. He didn't want Todd getting the job. "Yeah, I'm on it." Louie's brows narrowed. "Was there or was there not an elephant?" "There is." "Where's the permit?" "She has 30 days, and I've already told her that." "You make a report about it?" McCoy's lips flattened. "Not yet." Todd smirked. "She must be cute." McCoy's jaw hardened, but he tried not to react. It's what Todd wanted. Todd knew he was straight as an arrow. "Better write that report before you leave. Elephants are a little different than a dog that doesn't have a license." "I know. I've already looked into the law, and I'm helping her comply." More than helping her, he was building her fence. That was probably crossing the line he'd spent his life trying not to cross, and he wasn't going to mention it in front of Todd, if he mentioned it at all. He probably would have helped any one of his neighbors build a fence. Thing was, he wasn't expecting to enjoy it. He'd found out last night that along with the odd attraction he felt toward Jillian, he actually liked her. She'd worked alongside of him and had pretended the whole time that her hands weren't killing her, when he knew doggone well that they had to hurt like heck. How could he not admire grit like that? Then that little smile she'd given him before she left. A man could take a smile like that every day of his life. Louie's hand dropped down from his beard. "I need a permit. You're right, she has 30 days. In the meantime, I want you out there every week." "I'm on it. Actually going twice a week. One scheduled inspection, one unscheduled. Just did an unscheduled yesterday, and everything looked fine. Except for the fence, which was still going up." Louie's eyes sparkled and his beard parted as he smiled. "Figures you'd do double duty." Maybe I need to go inspect the elephant, Todd said, a speculative look on his face. McCoy was walking a fine line. If he was too defensive, Todd would be suspicious, but he didn't want Todd hanging around Jillian. He didn't stop to question why. He shrugged. Up to Louie. If you want to take it from me, go ahead. But it's a mile from my house. But you're not going to be home tonight. Maybe the little elephant handler needs some help putting her big animal to bed. Todd didn't smile, but he lifted a suggestive eyebrow. McCoy looked at Louie, who was shaking his head. No, if McCoy has this under control, we're good. You take care of your assignments, Todd. He stacked some papers on his desk and moved a folder. You two know you are the only ones in the running for my position when I move up to regional. They'll be announcing which of you are taking my place soon. He stroked his beard again. I'm not sure when. McCoy shrugged, although part of him was eager to know. If he got Louie's position, he wouldn't have to leave Uncle Roy alone at nights. Louie looked at McCoy. Elephant report. On my desk. His gaze moved to Todd. Get to work. McCoy walked out, Todd on his heels. As soon as the office door was shut, Todd said, Is she cute? She must be young. Married? Didn't ask. McCoy walked into his office. It was smaller but just as sparsely furnished as Louie's. Todd followed him in. Why does she have an elephant? McCoy walked around and sat at his desk, switching his computer on. Someone gave it to her, I think. You think? Technically, she doesn't have to answer my questions. Maybe I need to go out. Women enjoy talking to me. Not Jillian. Where did that thought come from? McCoy had no idea who Jillian would talk to, although she seemed to loosen up to him after he'd been there for a while. And she was going to cook for him Friday night, because he was building her fence. He pictured her snapping black eyes and her sweet smile. Yeah, he was probably too boring for the likes of her, but he could enjoy Friday night, even if he did have to build a fence first. He pulled up his computer program and started the report, eager for Friday. Jillian paced in her kitchen. Her second Friday class had left an hour ago, and she almost had supper put together, but she was unsure what time McCoy was coming. She hadn't asked and didn't have his number. 5, 6, 4. The wall clock said 3:30. Rather than stressing, she figured she could try her distant cousin, Augusto, the person loosely in charge of the animals in the circus, for the 100th time. He'd not returned any of her calls, but if anyone knew why Heidi had been dropped off on her doorstep, it would be Augusto. He answered after her second ring. Bueno. After having been around her American family so long, the customary Mexican greeting felt off. Augusto, it's Jillian. Jillian, my little darling, how are you doing? He wasn't interested in hearing about her sore hands. They didn't hurt as sharply as they had the night McCoy was here, but even holding her phone produced pinches of pain. I'm fine, except I have an elephant in my barn. Are you working in the circus? His voice was smooth and held no hint of surprise. She leaned her head against the cold glass of the door window. No, it closed. I know you know that. You were there. But a new circus, no? You are working in a new circus? She looked out at the dog kennel. No, I'm done with the circus. I'm training dogs. What about your hair routine, bending into shapes? It's over, Augusto. Then you don't need Heidi? Jillian almost rolled her eyes, pretty sure that Augusto knew she wasn't in a circus of any kind and didn't need an elephant. Where's Hazel? I think someone bought her. I will have to check with David. She hadn't been able to get a hold of David. What am I supposed to do with Heidi? She is in the U.S. and none of us can get her permit. I'm not any different than any of you. I can't get her a permit either. Jillian wrapped one arm around her stomach. Augusto wasn't any help at all. You have an American father. You can do it. I don't even know my father's name. I'm not an American. Augusto sighed. We cannot take Heidi back to Mexico. We couldn't take her over the border. You need to keep her. Will you find out who bought Hazel? Maybe the person would want a second elephant. Although why they wouldn't have bought two in the first place was too logical of a question. A headache throbbed behind Jillian's eyes. I will try. Call me when you get it, please. I can't get a permit. Not to mention, I need to find someone who can afford to feed her. McCoy's truck pulled down past the old farmhouse. It slowed as he approached the bend for the barn, but then he came straight, heading toward her small house. I will check, Augusto said. Thanks. They hung up. In a few seconds, McCoy's boots thumped on the porch. She ran a hand down her smooth hair, reminding herself this wasn't a date or even close, and didn't wait for him to knock, but opened the door before he had his hand raised. Hey, he said. His scent drifted to her, warm and male and intriguing. He had changed out of his uniform and wore a white t-shirt with clean but worn blue jeans and boots. His cheeks were smooth, like he'd shaved before he'd come, and his square jaw and deep blue eyes made her heart race. She fought the urge to fidget. Come on in. He stayed on the porch. Will it hold? We could probably have the fence done before dark. Okay, that wasn't exactly romantic. She was getting all bothered by his scent and his eyes and those biceps, and he was worried about the fence. Exactly what he'd come for. She felt like a dope. Sure, it's in the slow cooker. Let me turn it down. You can still come in. You don't have to wait on the porch. And now she was babbling. She snapped her mouth shut. Turning, she let the door open so he could choose whether he wanted to wait on the porch or come in. Whatever. She turned the slow cooker down and headed out. He leaned against the door jamb, straightening as she approached. You sure it's not a problem to wait? I'd like to get the fence done. He didn't move from the doorway. How are your hands? Fine, she said. His lips pursed. He remained in her way. Fine. She held her hands out, palms up. He hissed through his teeth. You still have the gloves I gave you? Yes. He expelled a thoughtful breath. I'm going to need someone to hold the rails. Do you think you can? Yes. His lips flattened, but he didn't say more, moving so she could go through the door and close it. They stepped off the small porch. Snickers hopped out along with them. You can ride with me. I'll drive us down. I'm afraid Snickers might get hit. He can get in, too. She hadn't been sure he'd let the dog in his truck. Okay, thanks. Oddly, he came over to the passenger side along with her, and she wondered what in the world he was going to do. Surely he hadn't meant for her to drive. But he opened the passenger door and looked at her. She assumed it meant she was supposed to get in. Her mouth dropped. Had anyone ever opened her door for her? Is it dirty? He looked around the door, like his pickup would somehow look different than it had 3 minutes ago when he'd parked it.
"You're opening the door for me."
Wariness settled over his features. "You're one of those women who yell at men who opens doors for them?"
"I'm one of those women who's never met a man who wanted to open a door for me."
He stared at her. His brows went up and he grunted. Then one side of his mouth turned up in the lopsided grin she had started to love when they put the posts in. "Guess you just did," he murmured, still smiling. Why did she have such a hard time pulling her eyes away from his? Her breaths came in shaky bursts and her heart seemed to beat extra loud in her chest. Snickers whined at her feet, and she broke away from his gaze.
"Come on, boy."
She climbed up on her seat and Snickers jumped up on her lap. McCoy's eyes still sparkled as he closed her door. What was she thinking? He was the dog catcher, a government employee, totally off limits to her. And yet, her eyes tracked his progress as he walked around the front of his truck. She had to force herself to look away as he opened the door and got in. He drove slowly to the barn. "How's the elephant doing?" Oh yeah, he was supposed to be keeping track of that, too. He wasn't there for a social visit.
"I think she's a little depressed."
He quirked a brow in her direction. Depressed? His tone said he didn't believe it.
"Yeah, she was always with her sister. They were never apart, not for anything. And now she's alone."
Huh.
"Elephants are actually very intelligent. They do have feelings, as hard as it might be to believe."
Gotta say, it sounds a little far-fetched to me, but I've never been around an elephant before, and you apparently spent your life with them, so I guess that makes you the expert. He turned the truck toward the barn.
"Really?"
Lines appeared between his brows as he looked over at her. "Yeah, of course. What do I know about elephants?" She stared at the dash, shaking her head. One would never hear a Mexican official admitting that they were not the expert in anything, at least in her experience. And McCoy's job was as an animal control officer. She couldn't believe he was admitting that she, a Mexican with no education, who didn't even belong here, was the expert. Of course, he didn't know she didn't belong in the country.
"You probably won't ever run into this situation again, but I can teach you a little."
She gripped her fingers in Snickers' fur.
"If you want, of course."
"I'd love to learn." He sounded sincere.
"Then I'll do it. You already aren't afraid of her. That's important, because they can sense that."
"Apparently you can, too."
"Sense that you're not afraid?"
He nodded.
"Of course. You were leery, especially before you knew I knew her, but you were never afraid."
He stopped at the gate and she opened her door. "I didn't realize you were watching me."
"I had to."
Her eyes widened, shocked that she had allowed that to come out, and she almost popped a hand over her mouth. Instead, she jumped out. Snickers landed beside her and she closed the door before he could ask about her odd statement. Chapter 8. McCoy hadn't forgotten what Jillian had said by the time the last rail was fitted and attached. Why had she felt she had to watch him? To protect her elephant? Surely she knew he wouldn't hurt it. But nothing else made sense. Unless she thought he was going to hog-tie the beast and throw it in the back of his pickup, hauling it down to the shelter. Maybe. In his experience, women weren't always logical. His mother certainly hadn't been. choosing to leave his hard-working, steady father to chase after some hard-drinking, big-partying man. She wasn't with that guy anymore, but she never had come home. Eventually, his dad had found another woman and moved to Florida to marry her. She'd left him as well. His dad had said he wasn't moving again. Still, for Jillian, it seemed like an odd thing to say, and the expression on her face meant she hadn't meant to say it. She had been wary of him at first, but he assumed it was because of his job. He thought she'd been getting more comfortable and realizing that he was a human, just like her, nothing to be afraid of. But maybe that wasn't it. Could she be being nice to him to try to get special favors because of her elephant? Not the fence. He'd volunteered to do that himself. But maybe that gave her the idea? If not, why did she feel she had to watch him? And why didn't she want him to know? He didn't know the answers, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. He preferred thinking that she kind of liked him. Nothing beyond friendship, of course, but he could handle being friends with someone like Jillian. She'd pulled her weight this afternoon, despite her sore hands. He'd tried to make sure she didn't do anything to hurt them more, but she had resisted his efforts to give her easy jobs. He admired that.
McCoy, come here.
He put the last of his tools in his toolbox and slammed the lid shut. The sun had settled below the mountain, but it was still light enough to see. He stepped under the barn roof.
Walk slow.
Jillian's voice, with its lilting accent, came from back in the corner. He followed her command, arriving at her side as she stroked the elephant's trunk.
Her head is hanging down some, and her ears aren't up. They're kind of droopy. That's what makes me think she's depressed. That and, see her eyes? It looks like there are tears in them.
He couldn't really tell that about the head, but he could see that the ears weren't flapping back and forth, but kind of hung down. He could also see that her eyes did indeed seem to have tears. Interesting. And you think she's missing her sister?
I'm almost sure of it.
What are you going to do about it?
I want to find her.
You're going to have 2 elephants? He could hardly believe it.
No, I can't afford to feed one. Maybe the person who has her sister wants another. Or maybe whoever sold her sister to him knows someone else who would like an elephant.
Well, the second idea seems like a possibility, but if whoever bought her sister wanted a second elephant, he probably would have gotten them both together.
Unless they weren't together when he bought them. I'd want to see where he's keeping her and how he's treating her anyway. But you're probably right.
She stroked the trunk again.
Would you like to touch her?
I know you said I wasn't afraid, but I do remember hearing horror stories about elephants who attacked their handler or went berserk in a crowd.
She's not really acting like herself, and any wild animal is unpredictable, but I wouldn't suggest it if I thought there was going to be a problem. She normally loves attention.
Okay. He wasn't sure about this, but he trusted her.
Give me your hand.
She held her own hand out, palm up. He placed his hand in hers. It was warm and rough. She used both of her hands to hold it. Moving Heidi's trunk gently, she helped Heidi sniff McCoy's hand. Her trunk patted up his arm and over his face and hair. He held himself frozen in place. She hadn't even had to tell him to be still, but she could see his teeth gleam in the dim light. Softly, she said,
It feels weird, doesn't it?
I'm just hoping it doesn't feel like lunch to her. Jillian chuckled low.
I think she likes you. You can pet her now.
He ran his hand over her front shoulder, as high as he could reach. I expected her to feel rougher.
Like sandpaper?
Yeah, exactly. It's rough, but it's not grainy.
Like nothing we've ever felt before.
She'd missed working with the elephants. Hadn't really thought she'd ever touch one again. There was something special about sharing her love with McCoy. Doesn't it hurt your hands to touch her? He asked.
A little.
Just then his stomach growled.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sometime you're here in the daylight, and we're not building fence. I'll show you some of the things Heidi and I can do together.
I'd love to see it. You guys had your own act?
Yes, with Hazel, her sister.
She stepped away, and McCoy followed. You trained them?
Not completely. I worked under the trainer, but Heidi and her sister were my special project. I worked out a reward system that seemed to work with them.
Interesting. I've never met an elephant trainer before. His words seemed to echo hers where she said she'd never had anyone open her car door before.
Elephant trainer might be a little much. Heidi and her sister are the only two I've worked with.
They'd reached the truck, and she walked ahead to open the gate while he jumped in. After he drove through and she closed it, she looked around for Snickers. He'd just been there, following at their heels as they walked to the truck, but she didn't see him. Opening the door to tell McCoy she'd walk and keep an eye out for her dog, she saw Snickers sitting on the seat, right beside McCoy, looking out the windshield like he was helping to drive.
Oh, I was looking for him.
She nodded at her dog, interested in the way Snickers had taken to McCoy. Snickers was a stray she'd picked up around Christmas time, and he didn't do well with strangers and men in particular. But McCoy wasn't exactly a stranger after spending 2 afternoons and evenings with them. I think he wants to drive, McCoy said, giving Snickers a pat on the head. Snickers leaned into him, and Jillian could hardly believe that her dog that hated men was cuddled up to McCoy. She climbed in and Snickers barely noticed. He certainly didn't seem to care if Jillian was with him or not. Back when she was young, different people at the circus had said dogs and kids could always tell if a person was good. If that was true, Snickers had chosen McCoy as a good person. It seemed like something inside of Jillian had chosen the same thing. They stopped at her little house, and she suddenly felt shy. It would be McCoy and her, alone, in her home together. Her life hadn't exactly been full of private, intimate moments with large, strapping men.
Come on in,
she said as she opened the door, which wasn't locked.
It should be just a few minutes until I put it on the table.
A smell, food, but not necessarily a good food smell, filled her house. She hardly ever used her slow cooker, and it smelled like maybe she hadn't turned it down enough. What can I do to help? McCoy asked as he stood behind her, too close, while she washed her hands, which only stung a little, or else she'd gotten used to the pain. Her heart had started to trip along, and suddenly her house felt really small. His presence hadn't bothered her as much when they were outside working. Open spaces, probably.
There's tea in the fridge. You can carry it to the table.
Okay. He moved in behind her to wash his hands while she dried hers, carefully. The smell was worse now, and her stomach cramped. Was she really going to mess this up? The slow cooker was supposed to be easy to use. True, she didn't use it much, but it wasn't that hard to cook some meat, throw some taco seasonings in, and put it in the slow cooker. But as she lifted the lid, The black stuff that had been blurry as she looked through the glass became clear. Her taco meat was charred. If it were her, she'd have just thrown a sandwich together. But she'd used the last of her cold cuts the day before. She didn't even have any greens for a salad. She turned, the slow cooker lid still in her hand, wanting to dig her toe into the floor. Yeah, he was really going to be impressed with her. And after he'd done such a great job of helping her with her fence, she wanted him to like her, to impress him. She wasn't sure, but she did know that at some point, his opinion of her had started to matter. He looked up from where he'd been setting the tea on the table. Yeah? His head tilted.
I don't think we're going to be able to eat this.
His brows lifted. She thought he might be trying to hold back a smile. He walked over and peered in the pot, then nodded. I thought it might be salvageable, but even the middle is black. She pulled her lips in, biting them, and nodded. He straightened. Can I say this is kind of a relief to me? Because my stomach stopped growling as soon as I smelled it? Normally, she was pretty unflappable, the result of a childhood spent not allowing the previous bad performance to impact the next performance. But although she'd made some pretty embarrassing blunders in front of large crowds, this was the first time in her life she wanted to burrow under the covers and cry. Everything she did in front of this man made her look incompetent and stupid.
I'll still feed you, but give me a minute to figure something out.
She would have to dip into her business account in order to buy groceries, and she hated to do that until she'd bought all the dog food she needed to feed the kenneled dogs for the week. There was also the possibility that one of her obedience clients would cancel and she'd owe a refund. She needed to keep enough back to cover that. Then, of course, there was Heidi. She'd ordered a load of hay to be delivered tomorrow. She'd have to pay for that, too. There was also rent, which Fink and Ellie didn't require, but she needed to pay for her own peace of mind. She couldn't come to America and be a leech off people who accepted her at her word that they were her relatives and had given her a job and a place to stay, and it helped her start a business. Hey, McCoy's hand lifted like he was going to touch her, but it dropped. It's okay. Sometimes things don't work out. Plus, it wasn't really fair that you worked on the fence and had to cook supper. She shook her head, unable to tell him she hated looking incompetent. The all-night diner on the other side of Love's isn't bad. Come on. He touched her arm. It felt like a shock went through her skin and up to her collarbone, and she jerked. Sorry, he said, like he thought she didn't want to be touched.
No, it was me.
She hated that cliché. She also hated what she had to tell him.
I can't afford to buy supper there.
Jillian, look at me. She lifted her eyes for the first time since she'd picked up the lid. His dark blue gaze was kind, and she could hardly face the compassion in his eyes. It's been fun working with you. I've enjoyed it. I hated that your hands hurt, but I admired that you kept working anyway. He blew out a breath before looking at her again. If you don't want to eat with me, that's fine. I don't want you to feel like you have to. But I'm starving and you have to be too. Let me buy your supper. She lowered her eyes, shaking her head. His finger reached out and touched her chin, tilting it up. Please?
I just hate that everything I've done is such a failure.
I've heard nothing but good things about your dog kenneling business. It's been clean and the dog's well cared for every time I've seen it. Uncle Roy can't say enough good things about you. And I hear about you in town, too. He shrugged. A few people have said you're odd. I won't name names, but I consider them odd, so it didn't mean much." She chuckled. "If you won't go with me, I'll bring you something back, okay?"
No, you can't do that.
"I suppose I don't like being told what I can't do any more than you do." He turned toward the door. "Coming, or am I bringing something back?" She hadn't expected him to be so nice. Telling herself that she would pay him back as soon as she had the money, she nodded. "I'm driving."
Or else we're walking because I don't have a license or a car, remember?
He stopped with his hand on her doorknob. "I'd forgotten. You'll have to tell me about that. I don't think I know anyone else who doesn't have their driver's license and a car. Not around here." He held the door and she walked through.
I'm not originally from here.
Oh, there she went again. The truth was always on the tip of her tongue, waiting to hop off. "I figured with that accent you came from somewhere exotic." Her chest tightened. Spending time with this man was dangerous. Time to shift the focus.
Did you grow up here?
"Yep. Lived in the same house all my life." His last two words were soft, like he was remembering something and hadn't wanted to admit to living in the same place.
That sounds wonderful to me. In the circus, we moved around so much. I never really had a home. I lived in a tent most of my life. Train cars, some.
Train cars? That seems old-fashioned. I never saw a traveling circus on a train as I was growing up. He was just making conversation, but he was coming too close to the secrets that she was trying to keep hidden. She stopped at the hood of his truck. He'd not gone to his own side, and she figured he was going to open her door again. Her heart sighed at the chivalry, but her brain scolded her to get some barriers between them before she ended up spilling her guts and getting deported back to Mexico. And what would happen to Heidi if that happened? She stopped short.
Oh, I forgot. I actually have some work I never finished at the kennel. Thanks so much for the offer, but some other time.
Jillian. She hurried off before he could stop her. She hadn't exactly lied. The pens could always be cleaned. He didn't call her name again, and he didn't follow her. It should have made her happy, but her chest felt empty and cold. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great Jessie Gussman audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.